You probably learned the answer to this in school. The Roman Empire fell in 476 AD when the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. You might remember the date. You might remember the name. What you probably weren't told is that almost nothing about that explanation is true. 476 AD was not the end of Rome. It was barely noticed at the time. The Eastern Roman Empire is like just as Roman, just as imperial, just as powerful, continued for another 1,000 years, finally falling in 1453. Most people living through 476 AD had no idea they were witnessing the end of anything. So, what actually happened to Rome? The answer is not a single catastrophe. It is not one battle, one invasion, one bad emperor. It is something far more uncomfortable, something that takes centuries to unfold, something that looks, in hindsight, disturbingly familiar. Rome didn't collapse. It dissolved. To understand how, you have to understand what Rome actually was at its height. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from Scotland to the edge of Mesopotamia. It contained roughly 70 million people, perhaps a quarter of the entire world's population. It built roads that lasted 2,000 years. It created legal systems still echoing in the laws of dozens of modern nations. It sustained a level of urban sophistication that would not be matched again in the West for over 1,000 years. This was not a fragile civilization. This was one of the most durable, complex, and adaptive systems humans had ever built, which makes the question of why it ended so much harder to answer. The first thing to understand is that Rome's problems didn't begin at the end. They began at the height. By the 3rd century AD, 200 years before the traditional fall date, the empire had entered what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had roughly 50 emperors. Most of them died violently. The average reign lasted less than 2 years. The army, which had always been Rome's greatest strength, became its greatest vulnerability. Generals discovered that the fastest path to power was not loyalty to Rome, but loyalty to their own troops. Legions began proclaiming their own commanders as emperor. Civil wars became routine. While Rome fought itself, the borders frayed. Germanic tribes that had once been pushed back or absorbed began pressing harder against the frontiers. The empire that had once expanded almost at will now struggled simply to hold what it had. Defending thousands of miles of border required an army of enormous scale, and that army required money Rome was struggling to find. The financial crisis at the heart of Rome's decline is the part that tends to get left out of the textbook version. Rome's economy had always depended heavily on conquest. New territories meant new tax revenues, new slaves, new resources. But by the 2nd century, Rome had largely stopped expanding. The easy conquests were done. The empire had reached natural limits. Deserts, oceans, mountain ranges, and enemies tough enough to hold their ground. Without new conquest, the revenue stopped growing, but the costs kept rising. Military spending in particular became crushing. To hold the borders and keep the legions loyal, emperors needed money. When the treasury ran short, they did what governments under pressure have always done. They debased the currency. The silver denarius, Rome's primary coin and one, had been nearly pure silver under Augustus. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s AD, it contained perhaps 2% silver. The rest was bronze. The result was inflation on a scale that destabilized the entire economy. Merchants stopped accepting coins at face value. Soldiers demanded to be paid in goods rather than currency. The sophisticated monetary economy that had held the empire together began to break down, reverting toward local barter systems that fragmented what had once been a unified whole. But money and military pressure alone don't explain Rome's end. There was something else happening, something slower, something that the Romans themselves could feel but struggled to name. The empire was too big to govern. At its height, a message sent from Rome to the frontier could take weeks to arrive. Decisions made in the capital had to travel through layers of bureaucracy before reaching the soldiers, the tax collectors, the administrators on the ground. As the empire grew, so did the machinery required to run it. And the machinery became expensive, slow, and corrupt. Local governors found themselves making decisions without waiting for Rome's approval because waiting meant disaster. Regional loyalties began to matter more than imperial ones. The unity that had once made Rome invincible was quietly fragmenting from within. And then came the migrations. The people Rome called barbarians were not simply random raiders appearing from nowhere. Many had lived alongside Rome for generations, trading with it, fighting in its armies, absorbing its culture. What changed in the late 4th century was pressure from further east. The Huns, a nomadic people from the Eurasian steppe, pushed westward with devastating force. The tribes they displaced, Visigoths, Vandals, Ostrogoths, were pushed in turn against Rome's borders, not out of a desire to destroy the empire, but often simply because they had nowhere else to go. In 376 AD, a vast population of Visigoths asked to cross the Danube into Roman territory. The Romans agreed, but the Roman officials responsible for settling them were corrupt and incompetent. The Visigoths were exploited, starved, and humiliated. They revolted. 2 years later, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD, the Visigoth forces destroyed a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. It was one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and it revealed something that would have been unthinkable a century earlier. Rome could be beaten on its own soil. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow unwinding. The Western Empire tried and failed to hold its borders. Provinces were lost, regained, and lost again. The city of Rome itself was sacked in 410 AD by the Visigoths, an event that shocked the ancient world, the first time Rome had fallen to an enemy in 800 years. By 476 AD, when Romulus Augustus was deposed, the Western Empire had already been hollowing out for decades. There was no dramatic last stand. The last emperor simply handed over his crown and was sent to live in a comfortable retirement in the Italian countryside. The lights went out gradually, and then they were off. So what actually killed Rome? Not one thing. Every serious historian who has studied the question ends up with a list. Political instability that made long-term planning impossible. A financial system that collapsed under its own weight. An army that consumed the empire it was supposed to protect. A bureaucracy too slow and corrupt to respond to crisis. An economy that had stopped growing and turned inward. Migrations of peoples driven by forces Rome couldn't control or fully understand. And a slow erosion of the shared identity that had once made Roman citizenship mean something. Each of these problems made the others worse. Each solution created new vulnerabilities. The system that had once been extraordinarily resilient had become brittle. Here is the part that should make you pause. None of this was invisible to the Romans living through it. Writers, historians, and philosophers of the era describe their world in terms that sound startlingly contemporary. They wrote about corruption in government. They wrote about the gap between rich and poor. They wrote about the difficulty of finding leaders worthy of trust. They wrote about a sense that something fundamental had changed, that the old certainties no longer held. They saw what was happening, they debated its causes, they proposed solutions, and still Rome fell, not in a day, not in a year. Over centuries, by degrees, through 1,000 small failures that individually seemed manageable and collectively proved fatal. The next time you look at something large and powerful and seemingly permanent and think it could never really fall, remember Rome. It was permanent too, until it wasn't.